The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 16, Waldheim. Outrage, bewilderment, despair. What words could adequately describe our feelings? This time there'd been no doubt. All of us were so sure we'd be released. Nothing could have sounded more sincere than our commandant's farewell speech. We'd left an empty camp behind when we'd walked out the gate. Perhaps there'd been some terrible error which would have us laughing in a moment. We didn't laugh, then or for a long time to come. To each query we got the same brusque response: quiet, march faster. Around us we saw all those evidences of German efficiency and relentless order that we thought we'd missed during these years. The smartly marching soldiers, the crisp commands, the well-disciplined fashion in which we were moved along. And I hated it all. Why this? The Russians at least had made some pretense of accusing me of something. But what did my own people have against me? I was ashamed of my fellow countrymen and their cruel betrayal. Again we were herded into boxcars. This time there were no stories. I was as stunned as any and could only pray that that slender thread of faith by which I clung to God's promises would hold fast. Our trip didn't last long. When we stopped, it was to be transferred into waiting buses. They were civilian vehicles with seats removed. Crowded closely together, we filled them to their utmost capacity. It was an eerie feeling to be driven in these unlit buses through the empty, unmarked streets of the city to which we'd come. Lights behind drawn curtains and shades told us that good German citizens were eating, reading, visiting, listening to radios, preparing for bed, doing a dozen normal, comfortable, taken-for-granted things. Some of them should have been out walking with their dogs, but obviously some sort of curfew was protecting them from any troublesome speculations as to our passing. The buses slowed to enter a gate between dark, towering walls. When the doors were flung open and we stepped stiffly out into the cold, moonless night, we could sense nothing but the tremendous heights of the massive buildings surrounding us. This is the prison Sachsen-Waldheim for hard criminals. Obey orders or you'll get into trouble. The good life of the camps is over. March. Did I hear right? The good life was over? God help us, I thought, as I followed the rest of the women up a winding staircase. It was extremely cold and very, very dark. With each step I felt that I was penetrating into something unknown and terrible. We were herded into a large room lit with 2 or 3 small bulbs high up on the ceiling. By their weak light I could see for the first time the faces of the 250 women with me. The same expression was stamped on each, a look of utter incredulity. Put your jewelry on the table. Jewelry? Was I hearing things? None of us had jewelry, nor, in fact, had anything but the pitiful clothes on our backs. The long, narrow tables which ran the length of the large room remained bare, despite the cursing and shouting that accompanied the repeated orders to give up our valuables. Fraud, one of our women burst out angrily. That did it. All of us called out now. We were promised freedom. This is an outrage. 2 of our women guards started to yell back at us. Did I say yell? It was more like the screaming of crazed animals. Never had I heard such sounds come from a woman's lips. When the noise subsided, one of the guards enunciated in a more businesslike voice, "We'll teach you to obey orders here, if you haven't learned before. Now take off your clothes, fold them and place them on the table, then line up." Shivering already, we obeyed. It didn't take long to remove the little clothing we had, but we lingered as long as we dared before exposing ourselves to the wretched, damp cold. After 5 years in camp, the guards could have had little pleasure in the sight of our thin, blue, uncared-for bodies, but none of us had lost our sense of modesty, and we huddled together in shame as well as for warmth. "Line up." The voice was a controlled shriek. You were ordered to line up. Reluctantly we obeyed and waited. For what, we didn't know. The cold was unbearable. One of the women fainted, then another and another. Someone gasped, almost inaudibly, the single word, "Help." Who said that? The guard looked savagely in the direction of the voice. "You were ordered to keep silent. Now you'll get it. Everybody against the wall, toes touching the wall." Try it sometime. Stand against a wall, toes touching, for even half an hour. One after another we fell, scarcely hearing, and caring not at all that the guards were shouting themselves hoarse. They'd promised to teach us here, and their first lesson wasn't going too well. We were marched at last to a room at the very top of the building to be ordered, still naked, to bed. In the bitter cold we huddled together like animals. From some far distant steeple I heard a clock chime the midnight hour. I had to agree that our good life did indeed seem to be over, now that I had fallen into the hands of my own people. It seemed that I had no sooner fallen asleep than a voice yelled, "Up, in a hurry!" Naked, we stood for 2 hours, guarded by a soldier, warmly dressed in winter uniform. Pleas to be led to the toilet were ignored, and we soon found ourselves standing wet and even more miserable than before. The church bell struck 5, then 6, before we were at last led 5 at a time down the stairs and into the room where we'd been admitted the night before to use the latrine. Baskets were brought in, piled high with clothing, from which each of us received an identical uniform. It was our first in 5 years, and again was a tribute to the methodical ways of our captors. Each 3-piece outfit, pants, shirt, and jacket, was of a dull gray hue with a green stripe down the pant legs and the back of the jacket. At least we were now somewhat protected from both the stairs and the cold. Next came the bread and coffee, the latter served in metal bowls around whose hot undersides we cupped our blue fingers. Now clothed and fed, we naturally wondered what we would do. The answer became obvious: nothing. To each of us was issued a small, backless stool upon which to sit, and that was all we were to do. For 3 long, weary months we sat. It isn't allowed to put your hands on the table. It is forbidden to talk. No, it isn't your turn to go to the toilet. You may not stand up. No drinks allowed. It is forbidden to talk. You have been told that already. At first we thought the regulations would ease up, so we tried to cooperate. It sounds easy to sit all day, but only when one can stand up and move around now and then to remove the kinks from back and legs. This permission was never granted, however, as hour after weary hour our aching bones dug into the hard wooden stools. It was 3 long months before we were led into the open air. We looked at each other in horror. Worse than pale, each of us wore a greenish pall on our faces. Those first days we could scarcely hobble about in the prescribed circles. It seemed ridiculous to guard such a weak and helpless bunch of women as we were, with such extreme precautions. Inside each circle a guard stood, machine gun at the ready. Outside each circle stood another. When after 30 minutes we were marched inside again, we could scarcely mount the stairs. That first daylight view outside gave us at least some notion of where we were. Waldheim had once been a thick-walled old castle. That explained the heavy, oppressive feeling we'd all sensed the night of our arrival. Of course, nothing explained the reason for our being there. There were no roll calls. We did no useful work. We weren't questioned. We just sat. One of the guards soon attracted our attention. She generally stood beneath one of the painted-over windows, rifle in hand, a troubled look on her fine blonde features. She was certainly different. When she was on duty, we were allowed to go to the toilet whenever we needed to. We could even talk quietly among ourselves. Soon we were looking forward to having Mutti, as we called her, guarding us. Daily the puzzled look on her face grew, and sometimes I thought I saw signs of tears in her eyes. When now and then she called one or another of us to her and engaged us in quiet conversation, I became unbearably intrigued. What kind of guard was this? "Maria Linke, I wish to speak to you." Startled, I would have jumped up if I could. Perhaps I would get some clue to the mysterious behavior of this guard, who neither shouted nor threatened nor beat us. "I'm interested to know why you're here," she said quietly. "What have you done?" Now that I was close, I could see she must have been in her early 30s, had a beautiful complexion, and expressed an air of troubled compassion. Moody had been well named by us. She could have been a blonde Madonna. "Well," I replied, "I haven't done anything that I know of. I really don't know why I'm here. I'd like to know myself." "How long have you been a prisoner?" "Already 5 years." "5 years? But your accusation, what are you accused of?" she persisted. "Nothing. I don't know. Spying, I suppose. But that was long ago. Even they don't believe that anymore." The telltale tears stood in her eyes. "It's strange," she said slowly. "Everyone says the same thing. There must be some truth in it. Criminals. I'd been told you were dangerous criminals." Fighting the tears, she ordered me back to my place. In the course of other conversations, I pieced together her story. She'd been working in the offices of the Central Police Station, doing a variety of jobs, when one day she'd been given a uniform and a gun and sent here. It was a special mission to guard some extremely dangerous criminals, she'd been told. A loyal German wouldn't object. Her husband had never returned from the war, and each night she went home to her 2 little boys, hating herself and her job. "If it weren't for little George and Ernst, I'd put a bullet through my head," she confided to me one day in anguish. "My own people, I'm guarding women like myself, housewives and mothers. It's amazing how the small human touch shown by this tortured woman eased our lives. Who could say that she didn't suffer as much as some of us?" During those weeks of enforced inactivity, we began to be taken one by one for interrogation. It was pre-trial questioning, we were told, so at last we knew why we were here and what we were facing. When my turn came, sometime during the month of March, I was pleasantly surprised by the civil nature of my interrogation. If I would just tell the truth, it would ease my situation. Solemnly, I promised to do so. My questioning took many days. They particularly wanted to know the reason for my 6 years in Siberia. The nature of my work between 1943 and 1945 as an interpreter for Russian volunteer labor came in for a lot of scrutiny as well. Since I hadn't become involved in politics in any way, I was told I'd go home soon. "You just got caught among the guilty, Frau Linke. It's regrettable." Heartily, I agreed. How quick I was to believe my interrogator. He seemed so knowledgeable, so sincere. Before I left him, he wished me well. When I returned to sit on my wooden stool again, it was just as uncomfortable as before, but now I knew that my days here were numbered. Once I faced the judge and told my story, there'd be apologies, reparations too, no doubt, and great haste to release my much-wronged self. I could see the judge's face already. More good news. We were to be given work to while away the time before our release. What joy to be led to another building, to sit down at tables with huge, ancient shears in our hands, and be put to work shearing rabbit fur from great heaps of unwashed skins. It wasn't the stench that bothered us, though, but the fear of contracting tuberculosis from the fine, disease-laden hairs. Resolutely I kept my mouth shut. Breathing I couldn't prevent. Though our job wasn't pleasant, at least the time went faster. We sat together at tables with no regulations against talking. As always, our main interest was our soon-coming trial and the freedom that would surely follow. No war crimes had as yet been uncovered among us in the process of our interrogations, and all of us had the same confident feeling that things were at last moving toward the inevitable release. One Sunday, our feeling of optimism received a shattering blow. We were bored, not even rabbit skins today to relieve the tedium, though we were sure that this day of rest was in no way a celebration of the Sabbath. 2 extra guards entered, accompanied by 2 male inmates. In the hands of the latter were placed barber scissors, and the order was given for the first 2 women to step up for haircuts. There was an instant chorus of voices. "Why? After 5 years, why now?" "No questions," the guard shot back. "It's an order." Well, I thought, maybe it's not too bad an idea after all. Since we can't wash our hair, it would be far better short. I looked at the first two unhappy women on the stools, then at the barbers. They looked miserable. They probably didn't like their job any better than we liked what was happening. With trembling fingers, the shears were raised and the greasy strands were cut as close to the scalp as possible. There was an identical gasp of horror from both of the women, and two pairs of hands were clutching at the bald patches. The rest of us began crying out for the commandant. They couldn't do this to us. We hadn't even been tried yet. This was something reserved for convicted criminals. The fluttering hands of the two women were knocked aside and the barbers ordered to continue. Then, when their hair was as short as scissors could make it, the shaving knives were presented. Now there was an uproar, with us yelling, the two victims struggling to escape, the poor barbers being ordered to continue, or else it was bedlam. It all ended as we knew it must. Each of us took our place amidst the growing pile of brown and black and blonde locks, to return to our own stools, feeling shamed and naked as we'd never felt before. When Natasha took her turn, I wept. She was a Russian girl, born and educated in Leningrad, and one of that first generation who'd come to Germany after the revolution. I'd met her here at Waldheim and had been instantly intrigued by this tall, handsome young woman who could speak so fascinatingly of Russian literature and recite such beautiful poetry. Like some of us in Buchenwald, she'd acquired the crudely carved wooden teeth that served as a comb, and with it she'd kept her hair smooth and burnished. It was a joy to all of us at night to see Natasha unfasten the single braid that fell below her waist and shake out the mass of black hair that covered her like a cloak. "It helps keep me warm at night," she would say. Now Natasha was on one of the stools, and tears were streaming down my cheeks. With each snip of the shears I cringed. It took longer to do her than the rest of us, but at last she too sat with bleeding white scalp upon the barber stool, at her feet the jet-black hair that had been her glory. On our way back to the dorm I walked as everyone else did, with head bowed. When we passed a door inset with glass, I looked up to see where I was going, and gasped. From the glass a ghostly face stared back at me with huge, hollow eyes. It was white and round and much too big to be human, and the projections on either side of the staring eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Sadly, I realized that the apparition was myself. This most recent humiliation seemed the last straw. Our womanhood had been uniquely dishonored, a rape of sorts. Now we shared whispered methods for making our hair grow back, if indeed the shock we'd been through hadn't stopped its growth entirely. Since scalp massage was the only treatment possible, the advice fluctuated between gently or vigorously. When a short time later we again didn't go to work, and 10 extra guards appeared instead of 2, we feared the worst. What else were we about to lose, we wondered. I'd begun to faint more frequently of late. It was a happy feeling to drift into unconsciousness, to be done with the torment of the hard stool, the rabbit fur, the ugly naked skulls around me. But the awakening was always terrible. The will to live had been so lively, but now I had begun to pray that the Lord would take me. I wondered if the increasing numbness in my legs and arms was the beginning of that answer, whether that strange feeling of detachment would spread slowly from member to member until the day when I just gently stepped into the presence of my Father. Would it be that way? Or would it be in violence and agony as I'd seen so many others die? With my weak faith, I felt sure that these 10 guards had something to do with that last circle of hell into which we seemed to be descending. What was my surprise then when cards were distributed, and pencils. In wonder I fingered the white paper, the smooth surface of the brightly colored pencil. "You are permitted to write a postcard," someone was announcing. Had I heard correctly? Not some new affront, some new disaster. We were actually to be permitted to write home. I turned my white card over. How was it arranged, this postcard? There didn't seem to be any room. "You must only sign your name. The message has already been prepared." Vacantly I looked at the black printing. "I am well and send my greetings," it said. So this was our privileged message home. All of us declared we were not well and refused to sign such nonsense. Those who don't sign will forfeit future permission to write again, came the impassive response. Needless to say, we all signed. To whom to address my card was no problem. My husband had been drafted in 1944. Since that time, I'd had no word of him. My father, on the other hand, would surely have stayed on in Berlin, provided the apartment had survived the final days of the war. This house shall be preserved. I wasn't worried about that. I sent my card then to the Blücherstrasse address and waited for an answer. None came. Weeks went by and still no answer. Dead? Alive? Moved? Ill? I asked myself the questions again and again. There were no answers, just the same tortured questions chasing one another in endless cycles through my mind. Having no letters of my own to sustain me, I began sharing Charlotta's. But then who didn't share Charlotta's letters? She was a remarkable young woman. I'd met her here at Waldheim and had come to love her dearly. Poor Charlotta. Hers had been a war marriage. She and her husband had had so little time together. The years of the war and now the years of her imprisonment hadn't dimmed the love, however. And when, in answer to her first card to her mother, she began getting letters regularly from her dear Manfred, all our hearts skipped a beat along with hers at each "I love you." The letters had raised all our hopes once more. Even Charlotta's sheared hair couldn't suppress her elation. My Manfred had a clipped haircut. Now I have one too, she laughed. A few days after our first postcards were issued, Margareta was called for trial. If there was one prisoner among us more important than the rest, Margareta deserved that distinction. Her husband had been anti-Hitler, and along with a number of other officers had gotten involved in a plot against his life. Inevitably, he'd been discovered and arrested by the Nazis. When the Russians took over, it was the old story once again. He'd allowed himself to be captured by the Germans. Therefore, he must really be a fascist spy. When her husband's story and Margareta's coincided, it proved that she too was involved and was merely lying to protect him. This, then, was the first of the dangerous criminals to take the stand in the show trials staged at Waldheim, the communist answer to judgment at Nuremberg. East Germany, in partnership with the Russians, wanted the world to know that they had as much conscience about war crimes as the West, and knew how to bring the criminals responsible to justice. All day we waited anxiously for Margareta's return to find out how it had gone. We waited in vain. She came neither to the workroom nor to the sleeping room. What could it mean? At last someone suggested brightly that she'd been acquitted and sent home already. Of course, we all agreed. That's it. And so it would be with the rest of us when our turns came for trial. Sometime toward the middle of June, my turn did come, and I was led away under armed guard to spend my pre-trial night in solitary confinement.